appeared, so the meeting's being recorded. Appeared in, she's been cited in multiple written and oral submissions before the International Court of Justice. She also has significant litigation experience, including as counsel in cases before international courts and tribunals. We also have joining us Dr. Tamir Morris, a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney, where he teaches and researches in international law, UN peacekeeping, international humanitarian law. Tamir also teaches in private international law and the conflict of laws. Tamir was awarded his PhD from the University of Sydney on the legal obligation to protect in UN peacekeeping operations. His current research focuses on laws of the protection of civilians and legal responsibility of the state to protect. As Russell said, please, as you're listening to this, add any questions you have to the chat function, and we hope to get to those sort of throughout the discussion. But this will be a full Q&A. And certainly addressing the points that were raised in the blurb for this talk. How do we get out of this mess? So my first question. We're witnessing clear and persistent violations of international law in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, the kidnapping of Maduro in Venezuela, and now in Iran with the latest strikes. There's been little or no accountability throughout in any of these instances. So my first question, I think I'll send it to ask Juliette to answer it. With impunity reaching such disturbing levels, does international law still exist in any meaningful sense?
Thank you for your warm introduction and for such a curly question as the opening. I will give you the lawyer's answer, which is undoubtedly unsatisfactory in some regard, but the answer is sort of yes and no, because international law is a vast field, and I think that's the first thing to keep in mind, that it governs not only the use of force, definitely problematic, and we'll come back to that, but it governs things including where states draw their borders, questions of the environment, who's allowed to do what in the Antarctic, and relevant to the current crisis involving Iran and the closure of airports and the stranding of civilians around several countries. It governs passports, it governs consulates, the fact that you have the ability to get onto a plane and fly from one country to another. All of this is governed by international law. So as I tell my students, if you've ordered a package from Amazon recently, you've engaged international law at some level. The oldest international organization is the Universal Postal Union. So there is an enormous body of law which governs our life in such a way that you hardly notice it happening. And I think it's important to step back sometimes from these moments of major crisis and say, actually, the system as a whole is not collapsing. It is still there, it is still respected, it is still enforced in a borderline dull and administrative kind of way. But then, of course, we do have the key issue right now, which is the rules related to the use of force, both the rules that govern when you are entitled to engage in the use of force, and then the international humanitarian law rules, which govern how you operate once you are in a conflict kind of situation. And as you mentioned, we have seen multiple breaches of those kinds of rules in relation to Ukraine, in relation to Gaza, in Sudan, and now in relation to Iran as well. And that is really problematic because at its heart, the UN Charter says we are here to prevent the scourge of war. We are here to ensure peace and security for the international community. And so it seems that there is a fairly significant failure right at the heart of this institution's mandate. But I would say this, it's important not to conflate breaches of the law with the collapse of the legal system itself. The rules still exist and are still in place. Just because those rules are being breached, even when they're being breached in a very dramatic, systematic kind of a way, it doesn't mean that the rules evaporate. And one example that springs to mind is actually in relation to domestic violence in relation to women in Australia. Over the last 2 years, last year I think the number was something like 43, and the year prior it was something like 80 women were killed in domestic violence instances around Australia. At no point, despite the extremely large number of victims in relation to this kind of crime, at no point do we start to say, well, maybe there isn't a rule about domestic violence. Maybe there isn't a rule about it being unlawful to murder someone. We see that there is an enforcement problem sometimes, and we see that resources need to be directed to addressing that problem. But we don't start this conversation of, well, the law just doesn't matter anymore. It's just all gone. Who cares? You know, people just do what they want anyway. And I'll leave it there because I think we might come back to this question of enforcement, and I don't want to rabbit on and on. I want to give Tamer an opportunity to jump in on this as well. But so, yeah, my answer is yes and no, and then sort of yes again. Like the law is still there, definitely.
So to me, we had the opposition MP Andrew Hastie saying today that international law is dead. I mean, what's your response to that?
Look, I agree with Juliette. So I think, and I just so everyone knows as well, I just came back from a class of teaching war law. And that was the first thing I brought up to my students is this argument, well, you know, is because we've been doing media interviews now at the moment because of the whole Iran situation. The first question we always get asked is the international law dead? And, you know, specifically because people are coming out and saying it's irrelevant. The sad thing is, and I'm going to just focus on the use of force because I do agree 100% with Juliette. I think there's so much law out there, like your aviation and like there's so much law out there that we still all rely on in trade. But I think what everyone's looking at is this issue of armed conflict and the use of force. And what I do kind of also reiterate, the law will always be there. It can shift and change, but it will be there. And so I think my concern sometimes, what is happening at the moment is, are we shifting the rules? So there are still rules. I don't think the rules will ever disappear. I think the rules can shift, though, with how we react as states. And that's, I think, the problem. It's not that we're killing international law, is are we shifting the parameters? Because what people forget is before 1945, this would have been completely legal. Like it was only from 1945 did we set a rule saying you can't do this. And so, but before 1945, we still had international law. It just allowed states to use force in, you know, kind of basic negotiations. You're allowed to threaten the use of force or blow you out of the water. The question is, are we starting to move back towards it? Like, are we saying that this is a normal kind of behavior? And that's where I get concerned of sometimes when states, you know, come out and say this is dead or this principle is dead. Are we now saying that it doesn't apply anymore in the international system, or have we shifted its parameters? And I think that's more of the question rather than is it dead, but are we as states allowing a shift in the rules than to say that this is now legal and acceptable in international relations? I think that's where the problem falls. And so I do get very problematic, specifically when Australian politicians come out and say, oh yeah, this is dead, and I'm sitting going, you don't understand it, specifically because if anyone knows me, and recently what I've been yelling at everyone, as middle powers like Australia, we are heavily reliant on that law, heavily reliant. And so for us to kind of just disregard it, hoping that the umbrella of the United States will protect us is kind of a bit childish, is what I will call it, because we depend heavily. And the example I gave, so I was on the news today and I got so many emails, very upset emails when I made this comment, but it is true. We have said that we're ordered nuclear-powered submarines. And we've said it to protect ourselves against China. Are we then allowing China to attack it, saying it's an imminent threat now? Because we've allowed it. And so this is a problem. We depend that we're going to get it and no one's going to attack us. And so we rely as middle powers on this. And so we should be concerned with the shift, allowing certain actions. And so that's where, for me, becomes a problem. It's not, it's dead. It's just, it could be shifting.
Very good point about sort of China and you know, the fact that we're saying things to protect ourselves against China when, you know, we are basically a US proxy in the Asia Pacific, and leaves us very open to any aggression from China, like you rightly say. But with the Prime Minister, and I know that you had a post shortly after or following up on the Prime Minister's comments that he issued after the US and Israel did launch their attack on Iran. And so I guess the question is, you know, how does foreign intervention undermine long-term political legitimacy and regional stability? That's for another follow-up question for Tamir.
Yeah, so like I'm going to give a weird analogy, but sorry, this is how I explain it to my students today. It might be a bit childish, but I do apologize. I go to them if I, take my children to a kid's playground and they start hitting another kid and someone goes to me, stop them. And I'm like, no, my kid adheres to basic rules. And they're like, yeah, but your kid is hitting someone, stop them. And I go, no, guys, my kid adheres. It's like actions sometimes speak louder than words. And why I talked about that shift is that's where it comes important. A lot of the rules that we have in the use of force are customary. And so it's driven by how the states practice. And so Australia was one of the first states to come out in support and not just sit on this fence like the Europeans have sat there and gone, we support the Iranian people, but we don't want to call this action legal because we're worried of the precedents it's going to set for us. We've come out in support. When Minister Wong was asked, is it legal or illegal? She went, well, that's up to the United States and Israel to talk about. And I'm like, no, you've come out and said you support it, which means you either don't care about international law or it's illegal and you're supporting it anyway. And the problem with us supporting it is we're saying that we think it's legal and we think what they did is legal, which is now going to shift, as I said, these parameters of what we think is legal for an imminent attack or what we think is legal for use of self-defense. And that could be problematic for us. And I know everyone's looking at the current situation, and I'll just say this now, you can have two truths that exist together, which is you can completely think the Iranian regime was terrible, but at the same time think this action is illegal, and they both exist at the same time. One is it doesn't support the other. But my concern is the precedents we set for future reference. What happens when someone decides we are not a legitimate government, or we're not legitimate, or someone decides they don't like us? Can they use that now as an excuse to take us out? And we've lost those parameters that we used to have before. And Australia doesn't have legal standing now because we kind of supported this and said this is legal. That's my problem.
Yeah, I know. We've at the Sydney Peace Foundation a couple of posts quoting straight on the Sunday, quoting Professor Ben Saul, and there was a lot of comments that came back. Is that you don't care about what's happening in Iran, and you don't care about the people who are standing up and fighting. So it is a very hard thing to navigate. And here, look, I will ask a question actually that Julie suggested after Julie Mackin. Who's on our board, also on the Australian Peace and Security Forum board. Given that we knew that the Iranian regime was brutal and slaughtering voices of dissent, particularly women, for at least the last decade, was there a point of intervention that the international community could have taken to build resistance and avoid this inevitable war? If this is actually why you think that Israel and the US are bombing Iran at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that the justification that's been offered by the United States has shifted several times over the last 48 hours. And so it's not at all clear that at any point this was a war of let's say freedom for the Iranian people, that was not the goal here necessarily, that was just a useful rhetoric for the Trump administration at that point in time. I think, though, it is worth just having a moment of conversation about this, because it's something I've encountered as well, is this accusation that by opposing the illegality of the aggression, that you're somehow endorsing the existence of the regime in Iran, and as a result, also endorsing all of their human rights abuses, which are lengthy and documented. And the simple fact of the matter is that those two things just don't go hand in hand. But the problem is there are plenty of mechanisms that exist in the world to apply pressure to regimes such as this. And imagine what a world we would live in if states like the United States put their vast economic and political resources into those collective mechanisms of pressure that don't involve dropping bombs on the same women that they are claiming to protect. We have human rights monitoring mechanisms. We have the Human Rights Council. We have, of course, economic pressure, which we've seen brought to bear when it suits the United States interests. We have seen, there are possibilities that exist here. And of course, there is always the possibility of going to the Security Council to seek approval for the use of force if you really feel as though there are no other options on the table. That wasn't even tried here. So I think there are plenty of other mechanisms which could have been used and would have been significantly more effective if the United States was investing in those rather than withdrawing from the majority of collective mechanisms that we see around the world currently. So I think that's one point to note. And I think the other point to note is, without meaning to sound flippant in the slightest about the severity of this, ask the women of Afghanistan or the women of Iraq whether they are more free as a result of being carpet bombed by the United States. It is really the case, and Robert A. Pape, who has studied this question intensely, has studied 100 years of history and said at no point has carpet bombing from the air ever resulted in a successful regime transition to democracy. It simply doesn't work. So even if it was your justification that you are trying to protect the people of Iran in their revolution, in their uprising, in their progress to democracy, you're not helping either from a very practical and evidence-based point of view. So I think that's the thing. You know, we have these rules for a reason, and we can get back into, you know, what those reasons are in terms of protecting people from simply being subject to violence because someone on the other side of the world has decided that they don't like your leader. If you don't like your leader, that's up to your populace to deal with. You know, that's the idea of non-intervention, that we put our trust in the Iranian people to resist the regime, and we support them as best we can if that's what they want to do. It's not up to us to come in and drop bombs on them, to drop bombs on a school full of young girls and call that a liberation.
Can I just jump in for a split second, just to dive on that, and just to kind of, I agree with Julie 100%. You have to put everything in context. If you look at air power regime change, the best example I was give is Libya in 2011, where we decided to change the regime. And everyone forgets not only how many people we killed during the bombing, the effects after, because there was a power vacuum, a civil war started, and we approximately around 50,000 civilians were killed during that war for people to take power. And so the question I always ask everyone is, how many civilians are you willing to kill to save civilians? Because that's really what you're arguing here. Let's kill as many people. And we kill a lot of people when we intervene, and not just at the moment, but the after effects. And so we also have to put it in context. If your end goal is to help, this isn't actually helping, and that's your end goal.
Yeah. There is the second part to this question. You know, given that carpet bombing is not going to yield any free, make the situation any better for the women of Iran or Libya or Iraq, is it possible to have an effective international rules-based order with human rights at the centre without the firepower to enforce it? I mean, you're probably going to say that that's what the UN is supposed to do, but in international, in looking at from the law of conflict, is there a way of enforcing a rules-based order with human rights at the centre?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I mean, again, as I mentioned previously, there are mechanisms that do already exist, and putting resources into those mechanisms would definitely help them to be more effective. But I think we also need to take a step back and think about how law is enforced, right? Because there are two ways that law gets enforced. One is through violence and the use of, say, police power at a domestic level, or the use of force at the international level. But the other one is through social compliance pressure. If you are isolated, if you are unable to participate, if people look at you and think you're weird because you simply don't adhere to the social rules and norms that are applicable in our society, you will feel a sense as an individual of an urge to comply. We don't obey the road rules because we think we'll get caught. We obey them because we understand that that makes it safer for everybody, right? So that's at that sort of individual level, and the same considerations basically apply at the state level as well. States need other states in order to be able to trade, in order to be able to prosper. And so in order to be a part of that community, if we insist on upholding certain human rights standards, we just encourage compliance with those standards without the use of violence. Yeah, I think it's entirely feasible.
Which kind of brings into me to another question about the double standards of international law. And I know this is a question that you both, Juliette and Tamir, get quite a lot. When the double standards are rife, does this system really need to be challenged? I mean, the answer I'm sure is yes, but is it salvageable, or are we looking at a collapse because of the double standards, because of the selective application and unequal application of international law, at least over the past decade, or 2 decades.
Should I take this one?
Yeah.
Okay, look, double standards have always existed. I don't think there was ever a moment in any legal system where there isn't double standards. Like, even if you think about a domestic system, there are double standards. If you are rich, affluent, you're going to get a better legal system than if you are not. And that's just the facts. And all the research shows that. And so in international law, it is the same. Unfortunately, there is a lot of double standards. And look, I used to work at the UN. It is right. Like, that's just what happened. There is a lot of double standards. Certain states get, specifically think of like Australia, we will criticize states that are not our allies, but then our allies, we reluctantly do not want to call it, because again, there's this kind of, be nice to your friend standard. And I kind of, to jump off like the last question, what Juliette was saying, I do agree. I think if we as kind of, I'm going to call it the people, because the one thing I don't like as well, just a side note, I don't like how sometimes we think states are just the government. We're the state. So the state of Australia is us. We are the state of Australia. It's not just the Albanese government that they represent us, but they represent us. And so a lot of the times when we talk about the state did this, what we're talking about is the government did this. If all the people stood up to their governments and said to them, absolutely not, we need to apply human rights standards because it's the best thing, then our governments will do that. Like, our governments do what they think is going to get them elected next. And that's just how it kind of works. And so I think our governments don't care because they think the people don't care. They think the people don't really are concerned. And I'm being very honest, like talking about my students, they don't care about human rights atrocities that they don't know those people. If they don't look like them, they don't feel like them, it doesn't really matter. And that's a bit of a problem. But I think that the way to get rid of the double standards is for the people to say there should be no double standards. And I think our governments will step up, because I know Juliette said, I'm going to jump on it. When I used to work at the UN, the greatest enforcement is economics, because what most people care about is money. So I won't trade with you is the greatest enforcement, more than force. States, and I do say this for dictators. Dictators do not care about force. They care about money. And so usually going for the money is the most important thing, but states aren't willing to do that. We'll call, you say, bad state, but then we'll still trade with you. And so why would the state change? And so I reckon it's very easy to not have the double standards, but our politicians will keep doing it if they think it's fine to do so.
Yeah. I feel like my job here is just to like nod enthusiastically as Tamer speaks, because I completely agree with everything you said. But I did just want to add, I think, one other point about the double standards. It's sort of tangentially related, but it's not. But it's a reference back to what Pete Hesketh was saying in his speech the other day, that was justifying the US's approach in Iran, where he said, there will be no stupid rules of engagement. And I was horrified at this, not because of the blatant rejection of law, but because how would you feel if you were the family of a US serviceman or woman hearing the politician who is in charge of deploying your spouse or your father or whomever out to war say, we don't care if the rules get followed? And so I think that's one of the real problems for this kind of double standard, is that the US thinks, well, we can do what we want, but the rest of you have to follow the rules for thee and not for me. And that is really problematic, because it actually makes all of us less safe. And if we can't recognize that we only have a right to call Iran out for its breaches of humanitarian law, which it has committed, we can only do that because we say these rules are important, these rules matter. If we throw these rules out, or if we say, well, they don't apply to us, well, then why do they apply to Iran? Or why do they apply to North Korea? Or why do they apply to anybody? So I think that danger of the double standard, like Tam is absolutely right, it's always existed to some extent, but I think it's really important that we don't allow that rhetoric to become dominant, because it puts us, just from a self-interest point, it puts us at risk. It puts our people at risk.
Yeah, because it's also interesting when we say, like, oh, Iran's a terrible government. Why? Because they're breaching human rights law. that's why they're terrible, because they're attacking their own people. So if you're going to rely on the law at that moment, you can't then throw it out the window, because then they're going to throw it out the window. If anyone studies rules of war, it only works if everyone's following it. And so you all both need to follow it for it to work. And so once someone throws it out the window, the other side will also do the same. And then, as I agree with Julia, that becomes very dangerous for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a good point to talk about Trump and his border peace, because he's doing exactly that. And, I think the border peace, it was 2 weeks after it was formed, it started a war. So that's a good track record. What sort of challenge does Trump and the Board of Peace I still don't understand what it's there for, except to build hotels in Gaza. How much is that a threat to the international rules-based order? I'll start with you, Tim, because you're on my screen.
Okay, so I saw a cartoon recently, and it made me laugh when it's I'm bored with peace, so it's the Board of Peace. I'm bored of peace, and so that was the joke, and I was like, okay, because it's hilarious that they start a conflict. Look, the biggest problem, specifically, as Juliette was talking about, these mechanisms. So we were relying on certain mechanisms, and what this Board of Peace is kind of trying to do is circumvent those processes and circumvent that mechanism. And so I tell everyone, when you look at the UN Charter, it was created to use itself, right? And so you're not supposed to use force, you're supposed to use negotiations in the UN. You're not supposed to but sidestepping that is one really problematic. And we saw that in this situation where the United States did not go to the Security Council. They kind of just completely ignored them, and ignoring this form of mechanism. So that becomes really problematic. On a side note of the Board of Peace, unlike the UN, so the phrase I use is, I don't mind if we're creating something new, as long as it's better. We're creating something worse, because the power is not vested in the organization. It's vested in President Trump personally. Like, he wrote the charter. It's not even the president of the United States. It is him himself. And he's put his son in charge in the board, and it's kind of a really bizarre system. And because of that, we're kind of enforcing what I call is the might is right attitude of this, and it's a very, very scary moment where we're sidestepping the UN. And I think, just on basing for us as Australians, that our government still hasn't 100% said we're not joining this thing, and is still considering it, is mind-boggling. That we're considering this, because all other European states went, of course we're not joining this thing. And if you look at the photo, the phrase I use is, these are people we don't want to keep company with. These are certain states and stuff we don't want to kind of be associated. They're not allies, they're not like-minded states. But yeah, it's a very scary moment that we're trying to sidestep the United Nations. And again, this happens all the time in law. Organizations die as new ones get up, but usually we try to improve on the last. So we had the League of Nations, it didn't work. We built the UN, which was better. I don't mind having UN reform and building something better, but this is, I'm reading the charter, so many legal problems reading that charter. And personal opinion is, if Australia ever joins that, I think that would be very problematic for Australia. But Julia, up to you, go for it.
So I had an epiphany when I was reading the Charter of the Board of Peace. And it's this: Trump is, I don't know how many crimes he's been found guilty of in the US domestic system, but he's famous, of course, for running companies into the ground and then birthing a phoenix company out of the ashes, and avoiding responsibility throughout all of this process as a result of this corporate entity. And I went, that's what they're doing here. They're creating a corporate entity to protect these individuals from these states from any potential blowback. Because here's the thing: if this organization is to be recognized as an official international organization, that's very much questionable. But if through our acquiescence, if nothing else, we recognize as an official international organization, then the Board of Peace is the one who's doing the actions, even though they are entirely purely driven by the will of one man. And so instead of the United States or any other countries that are a party to this being subject to liability or potential, action or responses as individual states, they're protected by the fact that they say this was undertaken by this organization, not by me as an individual. It's exactly like setting up a company to commit fraud. And as soon as I realized that, I went, yeah, that's why they've done this. It's not just to step away from the United Nations mechanism, but it's to allow Trump to drive his own personal agenda, geopolitical agenda forward with some kind of potential protection. And so that's why I think it's really important that we don't join and that we don't simply acquiesce and accept the fact that this organization has any kind of recognized status or capacity in international law. If we do that, we're giving it power that it doesn't necessarily have at this moment in time. And he's a loose cannon, right? Like, I think this is something to keep in mind. Trump is nothing if not unpredictable. You don't know what he's going to do next. And so I think to the extent that, as Tamer said previously, if we continue to just sort of accept what he does, we're allowing those norms to shift, whereas he changes his mind every few months. You could quite happily just resist his current position and then wait for the winds to change, you know, into the future. We need to stand strong against this kind of action rather than just letting it happen.
And there was just a comment in that you need to write an article about the border peace, and I actually do think it's worth a whole webinar, if not more, because yeah, it is frightening. It's totally frightening. And look, I'm going to move on to Francesca Albanese and the targeting of independent legal voices like Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur. Now she's been attacked for just outlining our international legal obligations. Now the fact that she has been so derided and so attacked, and you know she can't have a bank account. Her personal life is severely affected. What is it going to take to defend these principles so that legal voices can talk about the truth of international law? I don't know who wants to start on that one, Juliette or Tamir.
I can go really quick, and then you can jump in. So I like, and I think I've said this to you too before. I think it's the way I usually start talking about international law. I always go, I don't know why we see this law very separate to other laws. Mm-hmm. So if I were to say this company has, breached, consumer laws or breached a contract, no one comes up and goes, how dare you? Like, how dare you say that about that company? You just go, okay, they breached the law, and people breach contracts all the time. So me coming out and saying a state has violated international law isn't making a moral comment on that state. It's just announcing this is the law, they've broken the law. And there's nothing, it's completely separate from this immoral decision. What I think, unfortunately, states have started doing is to justify violations of the law is they've stood on a moral high ground. And so once you attack the legal qualification, they go, well, you're now attacking their morality. So a perfect example is what happened with Iran. If you say that's an illegal attack, everyone goes, well, that means you support the Ayatollah, you support, silencing of women. And it's like, no, I'm not. That's a very different argument. But the people have mixed the two together. And that's what happened, unfortunately, to Albanese, is that she was automatically framed as anti-Semitic, because she's come out and made an argument of a violation of law to the Palestinians. And so it's very easy to jump on this kind of moral argument of this is and so even going with the Gaza conflict, if you say Israel has violated rules, that must mean you support Hamas. Like, that's the natural go-to, rather than going, actually, I don't support Hamas. Hamas has also broken the law terribly, and anyone that breaks the law should be accountable. Like, and so, I think it makes complete sense. But unfortunately, and I'm not going to lie, our government has done the same thing. And so even if you look at the Iran situation, the Albanese government, the first sentence they said is, we support the Iranian people against a terrible regime, because they're jumping on this kind of moral argument that it allows violations. And then if you call out the violation, that must mean then you don't support the Iranian people, that you are then immoral. And that's what they've done to Albanese. And unfortunately, it's happening now to a lot of academics and lawyers, that every time they speak out against a violation, they are tagged as, supporting this or being a racist or being that, while they're just calling out legal kind of, issues and questions. And so I think how do we do that? How do we defend? I think we need to learn to separate the two, and allow. And it's going to sound, this is self-serving, but allow the experts who know what they're talking about to kind of say what they're talking about. So I love how everyone now is an international lawyer. Second America attacked Iran. I've had so many friends and people on LinkedIn write to me, and I'm like, I didn't know you had a law degree. Thank you for that piece of information. I don't enter anyone else's law. And I remember speaking, I won't say which politician, saying to them, I don't enter your area. I don't tell you politics. Don't tell me law. And so don't mix the two together. That's just how I think the best way for us to do is to try to learn to separate the two. Anyway, I'll leave that to you, Joe, if you want to jump in.
So, I mean, I feel like I have skin in this game because I get abused online a lot. And so, I mean, nowhere near to the same degree as Francesca, but it's been a really interesting thing to experience over the last several years. To be accused of some kind of moral failing when what you've posted is that the law ought to be applied equally to everybody. It's quite difficult to sort of grapple with that. So I think one thing that, in terms of practical things that can be done is to recognize and protect academic freedom of expression, but also to recognize that as lawyers, our job is to disagree with one another sometimes. I mean, the reason that you end up in a courtroom is because something happened and one bunch of people think the law means this and the other bunch of people think the law means this over here. That's the whole way that our field works. And so we can even have a disagreement about whether we think the very stringent conditions for the commission of genocide have been met in respect of Gaza or whatever it might be. And those are legitimate debates that need to be allowed to happen, particularly in this field, because otherwise we never get anywhere. If everyone just has to fall into line on one particular side of a moral argument, as Tamara said, it's not a legal argument, it's a moral argument, then we lose the ability to actually test out this law to make sure that the evidence is meeting the requisite standards and all of these other things. But I think, the other thing to perhaps bear in mind is, this idea that there are spaces where morality trumps everything. But how do I express this? In respect of the Gaza genocide is a great example. I get called a lot of names when I post about that, even though all I've ever sort of done is say that's a breach of the law here. That's pretty much all I've ever said. I tend to avoid making overt political statements because that's not my job. As Tamara said, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a politician. The problem is that people will say to me, oh, well, you're just complaining about Israel. And I'm like, no, I'm not, actually. If you look at my Twitter feed, I complain about everybody. I complain about us. I complain about Myanmar. I complain about Sudan. I complain about everybody because everyone is subject to the same legal regime and everyone needs to be held accountable under the same rules. There are no special exceptions where we can start to say, well, it's so morally correct, or this particular group of people is so special that the law doesn't apply to them. The law is the law and everyone is equally subject to it. And I think that's the position we really need to just reiterate in public discourse, is that calling out Israel is not anti-Semitic. I mean, some people can use anti-Semitic language and that ought to be condemned, but so too calling out, any other state is not anti-them or anti the ethnic group that makes up that state or anything. It's just saying you breached the law. Don't do that.
There's a lot of questions coming in, so I'm just one last one from me, and it's hopefully going to be a little bit more positive. And Juliette, I'll ask it to you. What legal mechanisms are working? We've seen the former president of the Philippines, Duterte, face charges of crimes against humanity, and we have Netanyahu and Galland who have ICC warrants out against them. I mean, do you think they'll ever face the International Criminal Court? And two, what other mechanisms are working quite well?
Yeah, so
it's this mess.
Yeah, I mean, I do try to rely on my knowledge of the International Court of Justice as a positive note for people who are interested in this field, because the International Court of Justice, which is separate from the International Criminal Courts, which I'll return, they are busier than ever. They are absolutely flooded with cases. They are involved in major questions. Of course, people have probably heard about the genocide cases, but we had the climate change advisory opinion, which was enormous. 60-something states were involved in that advisory opinion. It was quite progressive. It's really going to help build, an environmental law for the future in that space. We've got states who are resolving border disputes and all of these other kinds of things that are going on. It's still very functional in that respect. So I think that's a real positive note to say there are lots. I mean, Iceland, as of yesterday, submitted its compulsory declaration to the jurisdiction of the court, right? So there are states out there who are saying, yes, we sign up to these mechanisms. We believe in peaceful settlement of interstate disputes, and we think that these mechanisms can work. And I mean, goodness knows the court could do with some additional money to fund it, because it is so busy. As for the International Criminal Court, I mean, they are, of course, hampered by targeted sanctions against them in various respects, which makes doing their job significantly harder. But they are trying. And I think that is a positive, that they haven't capitulated under this kind of pressure, that they have stood firm in saying, yes, we are attempting, if nothing else, to pursue justice against individuals that we believe have committed crimes against humanity or other atrocities. Whether Gallant and Netanyahu will ever go before the court, I mean, the same question applies for Putin, right? I think it's entirely about politics within those countries. If the wind changes and those countries no longer support those individuals as leaders in that space, then yes, it's entirely possible, which is exactly what happened to Duterte, basically. So, I think it's the law can only do so much. We do need the people, as Tamer was indicating earlier, to put that pressure on their governments that this matters to us, that we want to see this upheld, and then see what happens in a few years.
Tamir, anything to say on mechanisms that are working?
To just go off the positive of we can change the government. Like, I always give everyone an example. If you asked me last year, would Australia ever recognise Palestine, I would have said to you, absolutely not. But because of the people's reaction, the government had to then change their tactic. And that for me is a positive thing. Like, that we can. So sometimes these mechanisms and the people reacting is a positive change. So even an example, so we were talking about someone yesterday's the climate change advisory opinion that came out from the International Court of Justice, that has now become a stepping stone for the Pacific states to go to the UN and try to get change when it comes to climate change, because of what happened from the advisory opinion in the International Court of Justice. And so the mechanisms, as I said, are working. I think everyone's just focusing on the armed conflict section of international law, which sadly is my area of research, which is problematic, but the other parts of international law is working. It's just we have to, again, as the people, insist on all international law being upheld, and then states will do so.
Great. Okay, now to some questions. Look, I might go through them somewhat sort of in order that they came in. So how important is it to normalize international law, and does that go to the need for a Human Rights Act, I guess, here in Australia?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that we do lack some good quality discourse in this country in relation to international law. We seem to be very suspicious of it, take it as a kind of foreign interference or whatever it might be. And I think, yeah, if we had, say, a federal Human Rights Act, that empowers citizens to use this kind of language, which is underpinned by an international law regime, to start to familiarize themselves with the possibilities of this kind of legal regime. So I think they are kind of tied in together. This whole conversations about what kind of model the Human Rights Act should look like, and this is not the forum for those. But yeah, I think if we have a populace who are more familiar with the idea that we have basic human rights and that those rights are applicable to everybody, then it's easier to start to see how that applies all around the world as well.
Yeah, and just to add sort of simply as well, also adding it to then our courts and our kind of vocabulary as lawyers domestically would also assist us, because it doesn't exist in our domestic courts. Our courts will not look at international law. So bringing in an act like that will force our courts to look at international law, which will also help kind of understanding the benefits of international law.
Okay. Now, here's one from, is it Misha? Is there a shift of the parameters for international law, specifically regarding the use of force? Is there a need? Is there a need to change the institution that governs international law? And if so, what would this look like?
UN reform, Tema. This is
Oh God. Okay. So I do believe we are slowly shifting. I think it hasn't formed yet, but we are shifting the parameters of use of force at the moment. So for example, what was, if you asked me last year, I would have said to you, preemptive strikes are 100% illegal. At the moment, I'm like, it is, but we're slowly allowing preemptive strikes, which is problematic because just on a simple thing, then that means North Korea can attack South Korea, India and Pakistan can go all out. If Ethiopia or Eritrea can go all out. And so we generally ban preemptive strikes, and this is what this was. And so I'm having a problem with the dialogue at the moment in the international community. How do we protect it? So the problem is everyone goes back to the UN and this veto power, which is stopping a lot of what we do. It's the veto power. The problem is I'm going to be very pragmatic. It's never going to change. The reason is to get that change, you need the Security Council to agree. And why would any of the states with veto power allow their veto power to be removed? Just practically not going to happen. We've tried different things of having extra permanent members, and there's all this discussion since I was working at the UN, which is like 15 years ago, still is existing to this day. And it will just rarely change because you'll need the states to approve it. And so a lot of people argue, you're not so, but don't get me wrong, there is mechanisms around it. It's called so the Security Council now, if they call a veto, it moves to the General Assembly and then they get to deal with it. So there's still other mechanisms that go around. But just kind of go off what Julia said earlier, a lot of this stuff depends on political willingness. So if they pass these resolutions, we need the states to then just start sticking to it. So I don't think it's the structure of the UN. I think it's the problem is political willingness at the end of the day. That's my first one.
Yeah. And I want to jump on this because I have a book sitting on my desk, which is this book here. And it's the biography of U Thant, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations during the 1960s. And this guy, like as an individual, he was in everybody's office, right? He was like, get out of Vietnam. He was like, prevented the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like he was just unbelievable in the things that he was able to achieve as an individual diplomat. And I do wonder if, one sort of semi-reform of, or just change of practice that the UN could engage in is getting back to that kind of personal diplomacy from the high-ranking folk, Secretary General in particular. The United States did not listen. They stayed in Vietnam for much longer than was advisable for various reasons. But it helps, right? It puts pressure on. You create these relationships with people and you can genuinely sort of ask them to do things, as a friend, could you settle down a bit? I think that is a field where the United Nations could focus some of its effort and attention rather than on, say, the Security Council, which is just stuck at the moment. And that wouldn't even require any reform or any changes, just a simple change in current practice.
So if anyone's interested as well, there's a guy called Richard Gowan. He is the horse whisperer of the UN. He's in the United States. He's written a lot about getting the UN to focus on specific things, and that will help them rather than just changing the structure of the UN, but changing their focus. He's a great guy to read if you are ever interested in this idea of how do we get the UN to be more effective. His name is Richard Gowan. He's from the United States. He's a great guy.
Okay, I think we wanted to read that. Just on the UN and peacekeeping, I know to me that's UN peacekeepers is your area of expertise. So many people ask me, why aren't peacekeepers being sent into Gaza or Ukraine or Sudan? What's happening there? Why the reluctance, or why aren't they able to go into these conflict zones?
Yeah, so everyone really misunderstands what peacekeeping is. So peacekeeping is not the world's army, and it was never intended for that. And so that's what people really want. They want an army to go in there and fight. But as I said earlier, if we go in there guns are blazing, blowing things up, we're just going to create a lot more damage. And so the very fundamental understanding of effective peacekeeping is when we have the consent and the cooperation of the state. So when the state is agreeing for their presence and willing to allow them to move, and they are really effective. The second the government doesn't want them there and tries to kind of stop them in every way, shape, or form, they become very ineffective. And so the UN is never intending to create or declare war. And so a lot of people are like, why don't we send them into Ukraine and Russia? I'm like, peacekeepers will not be able to fight a war. It's just not effective. Same as in Gaza. For example, think of UNIFIL, which is in Lebanon. The second Israel started attacking them, there was nothing they can do. That we don't want to start war against Israel. That's just going to create a lot more damage. So the reason we haven't sent peacekeepers into a lot of areas is just it wouldn't be effective. It will just create more damage, more problems. And we've had that in the past with peacekeepers where we had to take them out really quickly because they made the problem a lot worse because they were now fighting against the government itself. And it just created further conflict. So one of the primary conditions is what we call the consent of the state, is we need their consent to have them there so then they don't kind of stop them and inhibit their ability. But that's one of the reasons we never sent them to the Ukraine, even though it's been asked. And this is my problem with the new border peace, trying to send in this enforcement into Gaza. They're now just going to start fighting and it's going to be an all-out war. Why would you do that without the consent of the Palestinian, the Gazian people? It makes no logical sense to me. And all the peacekeeping experts, not even law, but military, have said this is going to be very bad.
And we have a question about why do you think Australia was or Albanese was so quick to support Israel and the US? And look, I would also add, I mean, Australia was the quickest, but also Mark Carney from Canada. Why do you think they were so quick to jump in and support this? I mean, what was illegal strikes on Iran?
Carney was a weird one because like a couple of weeks ago, he was in Davos, saying all of these great things about international law. So that one, I was a bit like, okay, we've got a different Mark Carney today. But so that surprised me. Obviously, not being a Canadian, I won't comment further on his policies because I'm not as across them. I can only offer this as a supposition and nothing more. But I think that the government is still reeling from the tragic attack at Bondi and the political fallout from that. And I think they viewed this as something of an opportunity to shore up their I guess, support for that site. I don't even know how to express it because, it's not support for the Jewish community because there's plenty in the Jewish community who oppose what Israel is doing and don't support it in the slightest. So it's very, I don't have any kind of inroads into what the conversations are going on in those hallways. So I'm completely speculating. But I can't help but feel that the rapidity with which we offered our support for this is tied a little bit to the ongoing trauma from that attack and the fallout that we've seen in the weeks since. But Tamer, you may have a different view.
Yeah, look, I think, I do agree, but I also think Australia is still reliant on what I call the old world diplomacy, which is, you know what, let's stick to the United States and hopefully, in 3 years' time when Trump leaves, we get a new person. Let's not upset America as well. So we keep supporting our ally. I think a lot of nations have realized that's not working and have kind of moved. I think it was a lot of things, but there's a bit of a problem we have with calling out the United States. And any of the allies of the United States. So I think that also came out to be, look at us as the obedient state. We're going to come out first and say, we support you, which I do think is problematic. But again, this is me speculating because I don't know what was being discussed behind closed doors.
Okay, we have lots of questions and probably just time for one more. I'm going to ask one on sanctions. There's a couple here actually at the end on sanctions. Would imposing sanctions help get states to agree to UN Security Council being reformed? Not sure if that's...
I mean, the problem is you'd have to be sanctioning Russia, China, and the United States. Yes, economic sanctions are a really effective tool of compliance encouragement, shall we say, in international law. But in this respect, I don't think it would be feasible to look at sanctioning those particular countries in any kind of meaningful way that would really impact on them. But I mean, look, I don't want to end on a negative note. one thing I might say on that, this idea of sanctions or this idea of collective action against the powers that currently hold the reins, is that there are a lot more states in the world now than there were in 1945. And we are seeing movements like the Hague Group of States getting together, looking at collective action avenues to uphold international law, to restore, you know, a kind of rules-based order, if you will, or whatever that's going to look like. We don't know. Those are still really early steps. But I think it's worth remembering, you know, there are a lot of states in the world who think that this kind of conduct is both unlawful and immoral and want to do something about it. And so what we might see in the future in terms of collective responses to states that we previously thought held, you know, absolute power, we have to sort of wait and see.
Yeah, so kind of jump on that and not about security, because I do agree 100%. I think it's going to be very weird trying to sanction the P5. But what, again, to call sanctions and this idea, there's a move at the moment, which a lot of us are looking at, is of this move of regionalism. And so you've got these regional organizations who are kind of stepping into the vacuum. So like the African Union, the European Union, they're stepping into this vacuum going, well, we as the African states don't want this kind of world because we don't want someone to attack us. So let's combine together. And so we see a bit of a push towards regionalism, which is actually a good thing because they're also, you know, trying to uphold this law. And so, yeah, I agree. There's these states, which I call them sometimes the forgotten states, are the ones who are now sticking up going, like the Pacific Islands with climate change. Like there's these smaller states stepping up going, actually, we want this international order. And we as a collective are very powerful. So it is a positive thing. Just because the UN looks like it's about to collapse doesn't mean international order is over. There are still other organizations around.
I think that's a great way to end, and we're right on 7 o'clock. So look, thank you so much, everybody who joined today. I think it was recorded. I'm pretty sure it's being recorded. You know, do continue to follow the Australian Peace and Security Forum and the Sydney Peace Foundation, also the work of Tamir and Juliette. Thank you so much, both of you. I learnt a lot, and I'm going to, yes, there's a lot of good tips also in the chat, and I'll, you know, look at getting hold of some of those books. So thank you so much. Yes, I think we all need to engage more in these issues, because I do think it affects all of us. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.